Hello everyone and welcome to Music Theory with Gim. In this installment of Analyzing Melody, we're going to delve into Gao's theme from Final Fantasy VI on the Super Nintendo. Before we get into any music theory, however, let's take a listen to the music. The theme is set in the tonality of A with its mode being major. That said, the music does modulate to the secondary tonality of C# with its mode being minor. This is not something we'll really discuss in this particular installment, but it will be discussed in an episode of Analyzing Harmony. When this second video is available, you'll find the link to it in the description below. And since there was going to be an episode on the theme's harmony, we're going to skip over the brief walkthrough that I normally feature in these melodic analyses. Before we get into the actual analysis, however, let's discuss the theme's form. Altogether, there was a total of 32 unique measures, but once the theme reaches the end of these measures, it loops only the second half of the theme. The two halves are essentially the same at their core. As a result, we're going to look at only one half of the theme, and because the melody of the second half sits more comfortably on the staff and is also the portion that loops, we're going to work with it. So in the first phrase, the core idea is C# passing through D# and ascending to E. In the first embellishing layer, we hear an outline of A major, the tonic triad, across numerous measures and atop various chords. This begins with E leaping up to C# in measure 1, which then moves down to A on beat 3, followed by an ascending leap to E in measure 2. In the third measure, E ascends to A above the staff, and then with a single leap, A descends to C# before moving to D#. By returning to C#, it is easy to see how all of this motion through the various chord tones of A major prolongs C#. It is also interesting to note that the lowest and highest points, E and A, are both a sixth away from C#, and they both appear just before leaping to C#. In the second embellishing layer, we hear the motion of C# to A in measure 1 is embellished by B, a passing tone, with A itself being embellished by G#, its lower neighbor tone, before leaping to E. And in measure 2, we hear the ascent from E to A embellished with conjunct motion. Though locally G# is a chord tone of C#, both F# and G# can be viewed as passing tones connecting E and A on a structural level. In the next phrase, the core idea is D descending to C#. In the first embellishing layer, both of these tones are embellished by motion to and from an inner chord tone a third below. In the second embellishing layer, the motion to and from the inner voice is further embellished with lower neighbor tones and passing tones, such as D being embellished by its lower neighbor tone C# before descending to B. And the return from B is also embellished by C#, only now it is used as a passing tone rather than a neighbor tone. Aside from these notes, we have only C# and D# in the final two beats, but they are operating relative to the next phrase. Before we move on to said phrase, make note that the melody of these four measures can be viewed as a melodic sequence. The harmony, however, is not being sequenced. When we get into the third phrase, the core idea is simply E. It's important to note, however, that E is heavily embellished by motions to and from C#. When the second embellishing layer is added, we hear the initial ascent of C# to E embellished with the passing tone D#. We also hear both the return to E and its departure embellished by a number of upper and lower neighbor tones, with the first of these being an incomplete neighbor tone. Like before, the final two notes of these four measures lead us into the following phrase. In the fourth phrase, we hear a very similar melody, but here the harmony is quite different, and the core idea is no longer simply E, but is now E ascending to E#. In the first embellishing layer, we hear that, like before, E is heavily embellished by C#. In the third measure, however, we hear D# used not as a passing tone, but as a chord tone of the penultimate harmony, B major. As a result, this D# is of a higher structural value. Like before, in the second embellishing layer, we hear the use of D# as a passing tone leading into the first measure of the phrase. In the second measure, we can view the C# appearing on beat 3 above B major as an inverted suspension locally. When looking at the phrase as a whole, however, it will be absorbed into the preceding C#. Aside from this, we have only E natural on beat 4 of the final measure, which is used to lead back into the first phrase. At this point, we've reached the end of the melody, so with our local understanding of each phrase, let's take a look at the melody from a global perspective. In the first phrase, the core idea is C# ascending to E via D#. We then hear the melody structurally descend to C# via D in the second phrase. In the third phrase, the core idea is simply E, but is heavily embellished by C# with D# appearing occasionally. And in the final phrase, we hear again E moving to and from C#, but ultimately ascending to E# via D#. So looking at the melody from a global perspective, we can easily see that the melody is heavily built around this back and forth between C# and E. C# ascends to E and then E descends to C#. This happens a number of times until we hear, in the end, C# ascend to E#. And this constant back and forth between E and C# causes E# to sound exceptionally bright and uplifting in the final measures. This is because it is literally taking the structural idea of basically the entire theme and intensifying it by raising it a semitone. Now that we have a better understanding of the melody both locally and globally, we're ready to take another listen to Gao's theme and bring this episode to a close. As we listen to it, try to be mindful of how the motion from C# to E or vice versa is playing out locally in each phrase, but also how it relates to the design globally. Also, do make note that the melody will remain written in the higher register even during the first 16 measures of this playthrough, but the chord symbols will reflect the differences in the accompaniment.